Welcome back, everyone. This is The Nerdy Truth, and I'm your host, Dr. JJ Walcott. Our focus is on harnessing citizen innovation to build for the future. And today we have a guest. His name is Dr. Cort Horton, and he works for a company called Q Neuro. Their focus is on measuring something called cognitive workload. In other words, how hard is the brain working while it's thinking, while it's learning, while it's doing some sort of task or activity. And today we're going to focus on learning, how we better assess what's happening in the brain in real time, and how it is that we use that information to optimize or improve how learning occurs. So without further ado, let's bring in our guest. So welcome to the show. We're excited to have you here today. And what we really wanted to talk about, and what I kind of introed with, was looking at understanding how do we create better learning environments. Mm-hmm. There is an enormous amount of discussion right now happening regarding education. And some of this is terrible, right? I mean, teachers and students having to decide between safety and being in the classroom, and then also questioning how much of that is really part of the equation for every individual. But there's something exciting that's happening as well, and that is that we're just discussing education and starting to rethink education and starting to say, is this the only way that we can educate people? And unfortunately, I think a lot of folks, because we had to so quickly transfer to online education, and because we haven't rolled out all the programs that we have available, there's an assumption that learning in different capacities that don't involve just a teacher and 30 students is somehow not as good quality. But in the military, in the medical sciences space, in the research area, we have all kinds of things that we've been working on. And I think that's what's really exciting, is getting the opportunity to share that with folks. So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about your background, who you are, where you work, what you've been doing, but then tie it a little bit to the research that you're doing. And I know it's a deep dive from a neuro perspective, but if we could relate it for folks to what this means for education, I think that would be really helpful.
Sure. And before I do the intro, I just want to piggyback on something you said there. It's interesting because education, at least in schools, is traditionally so conservative with taking on new technology that with this sudden leap forward, it's like basically just somebody came in and just kind of shoved the entire system from behind and said, okay, what are we doing? How are we getting this? Like, how are we using technology now? How are we going to find better ways to do this? So anyway, but I just, before I forgot that, I wanted to talk about it. But yeah, so much
important, because we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? We don't want to say we have one bad experience, so all distributed learning is bad. And and that's been something that we've been really trying to help message in the government. And I hope that as we keep, sharing different messages, that people will start hearing that there's a whole lot more here than what you experience in one month experiment.
Sure, yeah. So yeah, about me. So my name is Cort Horton. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. So my background is in studying how brain function relates to behavior, and trying to really look at kind of the nuts and bolts at a systems level for that, as opposed to somebody that might go in and look at, say, individual neurons, who's doing very low level work, or somebody that's just studying behavior, more of what we think of as traditional psychology. I'm in the field that tries to relate the two. So, specifically the stuff that I have worked on is child development, the development of cognition, of learning, of memory, of speech development, and of real-time tracking of some aspects of cognition, such as attention and speech, selective attention and speech perception is kind of my background through grad school. But after I've done a couple smaller postdocs after my graduate work, I really wanted to go into a more applied setting. I really like the concept of solving problems. That's kind of what makes me like being a research scientist in the first place, is that you can go from conceptualizing of a problem to figuring out how you would study that, how you would get at the information you want, to writing the experimental code, to collecting data, analyzing this. I like being able to take something from the start all the way to the finish on something like that. So applied work really kind of called to me, in that it's something where now we've got a direction that we need to go to. It's not just what do you think is interesting and what's going to get a granting agency's attention of what you might want to study. It's, okay, here's what we want to do. And in the company that I went to, the goal there was, how do we use this now commercially available neurotechnology to help people learn better? And that is it's a very broad thing. I mean, learning applies to any group. You could do this, for children in school. You can use this for people in military or professional training. Like, learning is something that we're all doing every day, right? So in some ways, it's a very, very big problem, but it's nice that you have a lot of avenues to where you can approach that. So it's been over 5 years now, but I came to the company's called QNeuro. So yeah, we try to focus on making educational games or educational training products that use, like I said, commercially available neurotechnology. I like to talk about these as kind of like Fitbits for your brain, that these have been available off the shelf for honestly a decade now. The people that are kind of tinkerers have gotten involved in this, or some people that want to use this for projects, or even some labs that don't have maybe the money or the expertise to get into buying a full research grade EEG system. They use these devices to start exploring some things that they're interested here. And it's just amazing what you can do today for so cheap, whereas there was a minimum $50,000 investment just to get started in this research more than 10 years ago. So it's really democratized the entire process of getting into neurotechnology and studying brain and behavior.
So break that down for me as to how well, it's a lot to digest, right? And sure. So what folks want to be able to do is make it tangible. One of the stories that comes immediately to mind is, as you mentioned, the wearable devices, right? So you have your Fitbit on your hand, and from that you can gain a lot of information. So I'm a runner, and everyone in my family is a runner, and so we use that information. Really, I used to take pictures and put it on social media and say I finished, because it's never fast. But my son, who was born with no chambers or valves in his heart, for him, wearing a heart monitor has allowed him to become an ultra marathoner. His cardiologist never thought he'd be able to run a mile, let alone, over 45. So it's interesting what it allows you to do when we say it optimizes the body by being able to measure heart rate variability. It doesn't mean a lot until you start hearing, wait, you mean this kid who shouldn't have been able to play basic sports in the intramural level is now able to compete at an international level in long distance running, which should have a huge impact on the heart. Another one that comes to mind is my daughter played lacrosse, and there was a team that got all kinds of injuries all the time. This is one of the national leaders at the high school level. Not her team, different team. But what they did is they also started using heart monitors, and they measured basically green, yellow, red. And so before practice, the girl who had been wearing her heart monitor for all exercise, so that's personal exercise, on the field, maybe a different sport, whatever, the computer would download all the data and then give that girl a red, yellow, or green. If it was a red, she didn't get to practice. If it was a yellow, she had a modified practice. And if it was a green, she full practiced. They eliminated all injuries that season. And so, making it tangible is huge, right? The parents got it. Once they figured out that couple $100 per student that they invested for this experiment turned into being able to achieve highs never seen before in this group. Because of course, for these girls, that meant scholarships to college, that meant all kinds of things. So now we translate that to the brain. Let's imagine then that we are able to measure cognitive load, similar to heart rate, during learning experiences. What's our hope to see? What would you imagine we're able to do if we can start connecting these technologies and then informing the decisions we make?
Yeah, so it's exactly like you say. It's a direct parallel of what you might do for physical monitoring, right? So people are very comfortable with that at this point. A lot of people are wearing either Apple Watches or Fitbits, things that are tracking these. And we've learned to see exactly how you can take this tangible empirical evidence, stuff that you're measuring, and find ways to use it either to prevent injury or to increase performance, things like this, right? So for the brain, it's been a little bit slower of uptake. I think people are a little bit more wary naturally of this. But it's also just because people don't know what it can do, right? It's really not that dissimilar. And in fact, some of the sensors used are the same as you use for a heart rate monitor, right? But essentially, what we want to do then is apply some of these same things of what can we measure, what information is available to us, and how can that do things like increase learning or prevent injury in that case. So you said imagine that we could measure cognitive load. You don't have to imagine that at all. We've been doing this for a long time, in fact. Within my field, within cognitive neuroscience, there's a lot of aspects of cognition that people have been measuring, and people have also systematically tracked how well some of these commercial low channel count systems, inexpensive systems, can do, and they find that they have excellent reliability. So we can measure exactly how mentally demanding a task is as people do it. So the question is then, how do we relate that to increasing their performance? And this is where the hundreds of years of education work comes into play. So we know there are optimal ranges for people, optimal kind of difficulty ranges for what people learn better, right? So some people, it's been described, as you say, in cognitive load theory. Back in the day, it was called demand difficulties or other things. Like, we know that you want to make problems as challenging and varied as possible if you want people to learn concepts, to be able to apply those, and to just use their time efficiently, right? If people are bored or if people are overtaxed, they're not learning effectively. That's a waste of everybody's time, right? So we know that we need to stay in this optimal range, and that's something that, again, in the neurosciences field, we've been measuring this for a while. Like, we have reliable indicators of this. So if you've heard of brain waves before, the technology that I use is called EEG. So this is electroencephalography. This is essentially putting little sensors on your head that you can measure brain activity. So some people have called it brain waves before, but it is these oscillations of brain activity that happen, and these things have direct correlation to behavior. So whenever your working memory is taxed, there is a signature pattern of activity over your prefrontal cortex where we can see when memory areas are engaged. Or if you are very drowsy or very alert, we can see these patterns of activity directly, and it's a direct measurement of this, as opposed to, say, if you're just looking at somebody, right, you can kind of guess if somebody's awake or not. If you've got some child back in the back of the room that's kind of teetering a little bit, you might be able to notice that. But when you get into a room scale of 30 children, people have found people aren't necessarily that good at knowing how engaged kids are. But this is something, again, how taxed they are, how engaged they are, you can measure this directly. So the question is then, how do we make applications for that help people learn better? Which I think I just took a really long time to restate your question, but the answer to that is actually pretty big, because there's a lot of ways you can get towards that. And in some ways, it's the problem that's so big that the question is, at what scale do you want to tackle this, right? You can look at very individual things. So you could say, I just want to measure cognitive load. I just want to measure how demanding it is and use that to adjust, say, difficulty or problem variety, or know when to introduce hints. That in and of itself is an effective thing you can do, but it's also just one small piece of the puzzle, right? So you might want to say, okay, well, I actually need to do a larger scale thing here. I also want to be tracking how alert they are, or maybe I want to be tracking something like their emotional response to things, right? If we want people to develop positive affect towards, say, math or other things, we want to notice if they're in an emotional state where they're not going to be receptive to this information. These are all key pieces of information that teachers could make use of, right? This is kind of, in some way, like kind of an X-ray into their mind of getting useful, actionable information out, right? So in some ways, you could expand that problem more and more. There's a huge range of things you can measure with this type of technology. So, but basically then you come into a balance of how complicated do you want your system to be versus how digestible you want it to be. If you want people to understand what you're doing, if you make this enormous system that's measuring everything that you can imagine and kind of spitting out red flags for any number of things, that can also be overwhelming to, say, a teacher or somebody who's supposed to use this. So there's a balancing act, and we at QNeuro, we've kind of focused on some simpler things to start to get people more comfortable with the technology, but in the back end, we're also working on ways of incorporating more types of information or kind of more comprehensive monitoring, so that people that are interested in this and are willing to kind of get into some of the nuts and bolts of what we're measuring and how they can use it, that they would have those options.
So let's take that and make it completely tangible.
Okay.
Right now, let's say I'm a teacher in New York City, and I'm going to be on a rotating schedule with my students. Now, traditionally, the way we determine that you have passed a class is by two factors. Number one, You sat in class for X number of hours, typically 5 hours a week times X number of weeks throughout the year. And then number two, that you took tests and got a grade and passed. There's been a huge argument that in fact, you don't need that many hours for all students. And usually one student needs maybe more hours in English and fewer hours in math, or vice versa, based on their personal tendencies. So now I'm a teacher and I'm staring at the fact that I'm going to only have these kids half the time that I had before. What could the insight that is derived from an apparatus like the EEG, but in a more simplistic form, do for a teacher or do for a student, or share with a parent to say, how and when do we learn more efficiently, because we're going to be forced to?
Right, so this is actually one of my favorite uses for measurement of cognitive load, is in disambiguating some of the questions that you don't get from traditional, say, adaptive software. So I'm sure you're familiar with Alex and other types of adaptive learning tools. So they're generally the way they work, right? If you get a question right, the next one's a little bit harder. If you get something incorrect, the next one's a little bit easier. But there's still some ambiguity there that you can't get just from an incorrect or correct answer, right? So if somebody gets a problem incorrect, it could be that they weren't even paying attention and they just guessed randomly, or it could be that they were applying themselves, but they haven't mastered that concept yet, so they weren't able to do it. Or again, it could have been a momentary attention lapse that they didn't follow some instructions, something like this. So if you're just going based on whether they got the question right or wrong, you're not going to know how to properly respond to that, right? Whereas EEG is something that can tell you exactly how you should be responding to that, because we can be monitoring in real time if they're applying themselves. So what you really want to do is know that if somebody's making incorrect answers and they are applying themselves, you can tell that they're challenged, they're engaged in the task, but they're challenged, they're not applying themselves. That is somebody that probably needs more instruction or more time to work through this, as opposed to somebody who's either mastered it so well that they're bored of it and don't even want to be spending their time on this, or aren't paying attention at all. If they're not engaged, we can see that. So those are totally different interventions that a teacher might want to do based on those outcomes. And that's something that EEG can disambiguate. So I love that. And that's actually built into our assessment engine for some of our products, that we're trying to speed our ability to determine if you've mastered some concept, to make it where it doesn't take as long for one of these adaptive systems to come to whatever a stable baseline of where it estimates your skill to be. We use the EEG data as well, using cognitive load in particular, to see how engaged you are, to know how fast we should be shifting our estimate of your ability, so that people that are trivially easy to do tasks, we can very quickly come to the determination that they don't need any more work on this, they're ready to move on to new concepts. And the people that need more time, that are applying themselves but still struggling through, they might need more personal interaction or instruction to help bring them to the point where they're ready to move on and finish that concept, and then again move on to new skills. Because it's never an end game of, I want to learn this one concept, right? It's, I want to learn this concept so that I can build on it. And so you really need to be at a point where it's not just that you can answer questions correctly. You need to be able to do it efficiently without taxing your cognitive abilities, because you need extra kind of headspace to be able to build new abilities on top of that. And again, that is something that we can directly measure with EEG and make better assessments, better trajectories for students where they're spending their time efficiently, not getting bored, not getting overwhelmed.
So I love this because it's a direct answer to a real problem that we're having right now. And the assumption is that students are in class or out of class, and that if they're out of class, they're not going to learn as well. And what you're presenting is one of, a whole host of tools that could be used that actually allow us to ensure that the students are still learning, that they're in fact learning more efficiently during the time that's available, and that they're still reaching those peaks, and we can actually, as you're putting it, measure it directly. It's not just a guess, it's not an interpretation, it's not an assumption. Now we're actually using the data to the advantage of the student in order to be able to take advantage of whatever time is available for instruction, but optimize it. So based on that, to close out, the question I would pose to you is, if we could take 2 steps forward towards this, recognizing that it's happening in the lab, recognizing that it's starting to get into military, recognizing that scientists have been doing this for decades, Doesn't necessarily recognize though that in the classroom, it's still one of those things, much like that lacrosse team, experimental in their minds. So what would be two events, tasks, or capabilities that would need to occur so that teachers and students and parents could actually see this start to translate to classroom and home learning experiences?
Yeah, a big thing I think is to increase awareness that this technology exists, that it's safe, and that it can already do things now. So when we go to, say, education technology conferences and show off some of this stuff that we've made, some of the software, teachers are generally blown away. They're super positive, but everyone thinks it's sci-fi, right? Everyone's like, oh, that's amazing. Like 10, 15 years from now, that'll be really cool. I'm like, no, this has existed for 10 years. This is ready. We're ready for people to take this and deploy it now. This stuff is safe, it is cheap, and this is getting at information that you can't get at otherwise. So a big thing is awareness there. So one way that we personally try to address that is by applying some of these mechanisms to a little bit more widespread appeal, like educational games, as opposed to merely assessments. We've released a bunch of free games on iOS and Android that are compatible with this EEG headsets that can use this to make gamified experiences more engaging, that will real-time adjust difficulty of educational games, and something that's a little bit more easily digestible, that's not necessarily going to be, say, the most efficient minute-to-minute use of learning, but is something that can show people that, wow, this is really reading what's going on. It's really adapting to me. When you put one of these headsets on somebody and hand them a game, and they can start telling when they get overwhelmed, when our game starts simplifying and like giving them helping assistance, they're just blown away that something can do this. And again, this has been around for a while. So that awareness is a big step that we're trying to get at by going out and showing this to teachers anywhere that we can at a lot of these big ed tech conferences, and just trying to get the information out there that, you know, this has been here. It's ready to go. So that's one big thing. Another thing is probably more to do some more crosstalk and try to get classroom feedback from teachers. We kind of need some of those early adopters for schools that want to get this in there, get this deployed, and start giving feedback both to us as to what types of things would be most helpful to them. Like I said, it's kind of an overwhelming problem of the amount of things you could measure or give feedback on, but I think once you get into classroom use of a lot of these things, when you scale up, you're going to find that certain things, you know, jump out that are more or less useful to teachers kind of on the ground. Or again, in training scenarios, this doesn't have to just be in schools. But I think somebody kind of has to give this a chance on a larger scale before you're going to kind of tweak everything to be an optimal setup for people that might want to use it. And this might be specific to the domain, right? So it might be that for, say, military training applications, you need an early adopter there to figure out how this works best in that use. For corporate training, you might need an early adopter there. For schools, you know, at various ages, you might need different early adopters. But I think that feedback that you get to get it tailored to what is actually most useful and what information the teachers are finding most valuable is going to be key, because none of this is intended to replace teachers. This is supposed to supplement, right? This is supposed to make, for one, learning a more efficient and more enjoyable experience, that you don't have people sitting around bored or frustrated. And it's supposed to give feedback to teachers that they can know when to intervene or to intervene automatically. Again, like a lot of our software is doing these interventions on the fly automatically in real time. So there's a lot of avenues there to figure out what is going to be most beneficial. And really, you can study this in a lab, but before people are ready to roll this out wide scale, they're going to want to see this kind of in larger use within a school, whatever setting they plan to use it in. So those are kind of the two big steps.
Well, great. Now we need to go find those early adopters.
We're always
want to have big thinking happen. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Horton. This is Nerdy Truth, and I'm Dr. JJ Walcott.
Thanks for having me.